to talk about one of my favorite books written by one of my favorite authors, and we're going to try to apply some of that aesthetic theory that I came up with in the previous short video I did on aesthetics to this book and describe how it's been misunderstood and why we can appropriate it for our own uses. Gotta have a lot of caveats here, though. Fiction is a story that's not true, that's written down. Literature, by contrast, is philosophy as fiction. If you're trying to communicate something like Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was about incipient Bolshevism and nihilism, which is what his book Demons or the Possessed is about, then you're writing literature and not fiction, even if, as was the case with that book, it's serialized and he made a profit off of it. So the book that we're going to talk about today is literature, because it's not a novel, I'm sure, that made much money. It probably made less money than every single novel ever published by Stephen King, even though it is both scary and violent, like a lot of Stephen King novels. It's very difficult to read. It's difficult to understand. The author seems to deliberately throw up roadblocks to slow the reader down. And then if you're not paying very close attention, you're going to miss a lot of things. And you just won't be able to continue the story, basically, unless you're paying attention. This is a Nietzschean way of writing, because the way that Friedrich Nietzsche communicated his philosophy was through aphorisms, which are sometimes difficult to understand. He often contradicts himself, and he says specifically in his work, this isn't for everybody, it's not meant to be understood by everybody, it's meant for the few of great discernment. This is a hierarchical, discriminatory way of writing, not for the masses. Give me just a minute. Welcome back. It ended up being a few days rather than a few minutes, and instead of talking directly about this book, which all these pictures are in front of us right now, we're going to back up a little bit and talk about the man and his work, and that way we can place this novel within it. Now, Cormac McCarthy was born somewhere on the eastern coast of the United States, like Delaware, Maryland, Rhode Island, something like that, into an upper-class family. And then they moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where he grew up. And so he's got a firm identity of being a Southerner in the Upper South, whereas I'm from the Deep South, so those are two different traditions. However, he's put often compared to people like Faulkner, and also to Melville, which would have been from that coastal experience. So he's bridging the gap in American literature geographically between those two traditions. His earlier novels are, I think, Southern Gothic. I wouldn't challenge that at all, and we'll talk briefly about two of them. The first is Outer Dark, which I think is his second work, and the other is Satri. And both of these books are heavily autobiographical, although they're fictionalized. Outer Dark is essentially a nightmare. It's a nightmarish tragedy. And so if that sounds interesting to you, he's taking these Indo-European myths and tragedian forms that you would find in classical Greek art and stagecraft and literature, and he's updating them and putting them into the Southern Gothic tradition. The plot, now this is going to be full of spoilers, so if you don't want the spoilers, you're just going to have to turn this off and go read all his books that we're going to talk about today. But anyhow, Outer Dark is a tragedian story about two twins, a brother and a sister, who have a baby. So there's an incident of incest, and they have a baby, and this basically creates a curse, and things just begin going even further downhill from the incest. It's sin upon sin upon sin, crime upon crime. It's an incredibly dualistic work, and it is a nightmare in book form. Now, this seems to have been brought about by an experience he had as a young man, in which he was being prepared for to move along in his family tradition of this upper middle class professional lifestyle. His father wanted him to become a lawyer or a doctor. I think his father was a lawyer or a doctor. And instead, Cormac McCarthy, he was enrolled in college. This would have been in the early 60s probably, if I've got my timeline right, and late 50s, early 60s. And instead of continuing his college studies, which I think he was enrolled in literature or something like that, he dropped out, got married and dropped out. And that's a big deal for a time in which not everyone went to college in the United States. It was a fairly rare thing. And so to give that up, that's a revolt against the father, which is another recurring theme in his work. So he drops out of college. He's married and has a kid, and he's trying to work as a writer. He's not very successful, and his wife leaves him and takes the child away. And so that experience seems to have created this novel, Outer Dark, which is probably the one of the most shocking and pessimistic novels of its era, that is not, I repeat, is not explicitly pornographic in its intent. I made this argument in the video that I did about Dos Passos and the USA trilogy, opposed to someone like, I don't know, just pick your favorite contemporary American. We'll talk about like Larry Kramer or Philip Roth, one of those type of guys, rather than just being pornographic for pornography's sake. Anytime that Cormac McCarthy has violence or sex in one of his novels, it's because he's making a judgment, and it's probably a judgment that you or I would agree with, most likely. But nevertheless, he believes in painting with a very vivid and brutal brush in his literature. And it's more than a lot of people can stomach, and more than I can stomach at some times. Although for the most part, I can read his work without trouble. So he had this difficult early life experience in his 20s, in which his family broke up. His new family broke up, and it turned him into a great writer, which is something that you can see in many other people. Dostoevsky definitely would not have become the man that he became if he hadn't been sent to Katorga in Siberia for those many years. And so suffering's not necessarily a bad thing, and most people in prior history would not have said that suffering was always bad. But when you get rid of the religious tradition and you jump into complete materialism, suffering's always a bad thing. So anyhow, that's what's going on with Outer Dark. Now, this novel, Satri, is the following one after Outer Dark. And Satri is a fictionalized account, fictionalized autobiography of Cormac McCarthy and Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1950s and 60s. What he does in this novel is he moves the time period of his own life back about 10 years. So the fictionalized character, Satri, that's the stand-in for Cormac McCarthy, the author, is about 10 or 15 years older than he would have been at the time. So when he would have been a teenager, Satri's already in his mid-20s or something. And again, in this novel, he has the main character's wife leaves him and their child dies. So these themes just keep coming back. He's got the same sort of college dropout, strained relations with his family that the author had in real life. And in this book, there is constantly shown in Knoxville, Tennessee, the divide between the white world of Knoxville and the black world of Knoxville. And so if you've ever lived in a southern city, you know that despite every attempt to desegregate by certain powers and principalities, this is not what the people want. Black people want to live around black people, white people want to live around white people, and then there's maybe 5 to 10% of each community, maybe a little bit more, maybe 15%, that are comfortable mixing with each other on a daily basis in terms of work and social activities. But for the most part, the majority of those two communities are segregated by their own desire. Now, as an outsider in this novel, Satri, the main character, the stand-in for the author, he's living on the outskirts of white society, which means he deals with blacks just as much as he deals with whites. He's a fisherman, and he's fishing in the river, and he's selling his fish to both blacks and whites. Let me pause this so that I can find something in here I want to read to you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the point of, again, I just always keep saying this, but there's too many points to talk about. Racialism. The author, Cormac McCarthy, is a racialist and an essentialist, and so I'm going to point out in this novel, Suttree, where this stuff is coming through. So the main character in this novel is becoming more and more disgusted with life in the underbelly of Knoxville, Tennessee, and with his own behavior and his own debaucheries, and so he retreats to around Gatlinburg, goes up into the forest, and is essentially camping rough, sleeping rough in the forest for a couple of weeks, not doing very good on food, and then so we'll pick up the effect that this has on him. He'd taken to sleeping more, and the walking made him dizzy. He'd watch the fire for hours, the curious incandescent world of settling embers, small orange grottos, and the way the wood looked molten there or half translucent. He had begun to become accompanied. First in dreams, and then in states half wakeful. One day, in the full light of autumn noon, he saw an elvish apparition come from the woods and go down the trail before him, half a jog, and worried of aspect. Suttree sat in the moss and rested. The woods looked too green for the season. Before 2 days more had gone, he hardly knew if he dreamt or not. Lying on a gravel bar with the tips of his fingers in the icy water, he could see his face above the sandy creek floor, a shifting visage, hard by its own shadow. He stretched himself and bowed his lips and sucked from the passing water, taste of iron and moss and a silken weight on his tongue. A newt, small, olive, paint-spattered, arrowed off downside a rock toward the bubbling green of the deeper pool. The water in his head sang like wine. He sat up, a green and reeling wall of laurel, and the stark trees rising, articulating in the slight lift of the forest wind some arboreal mute's alphabet. Pins of light near blue were coming off the stones. Suttree felt a deep and chilling lassitude go by nape and shoulder blades. He slumped and crossed his wrists in his lap. He looked at a world of incredible loveliness. Old distaff Celt's blood in some back chamber of his brain moved him to discourse with the birches, with the oaks. A cool green fire kept breaking in the woods, and he could hear the footsteps of the dead. Everything had fallen from him. He scarce could tell where his being ended or the world began, nor did he care. So it goes on like that, and the idea is that just mixed into his consciousness, he's tapping into his forebears, and that as one of these, what would you say, Anglo/Kelto/Germanic people from Northern Europe, you have a certain connection to these type of environments that people who are not from these environments would not feel. And that if you were an Arab or a Persian, or if you were a Georgian or Armenian, there would be mountains and hills or deserts and marshes that would appeal to you. Now, Blood Meridian, we'll talk about that. You can see the picture of the first edition here. This is what mine looks like. You can get PDFs of this online. You can get an audiobook of this online. I'm not sure if that's available for Suttree, but it probably is by this point. Now, I first read Blood Meridian when I was probably 20 years old, and I think I read it in 2 sittings over, a day and a half, because I just could not put the book down. And like most people, I didn't know what I was reading, but I knew that I liked it. I knew that it was something like something I'd never read. I'd never read a novel like that before. you can't really understand what he's talking about most of the time. I would say you probably got to read this book 2 or 3 times before you can get all of it. And there's no way that we could cover all the important concepts in here today. And one of the most important things that we shouldn't even get into is Gnosticism and dualism. And these are recurring themes in his work. And this is the most Gnostic of his works. Just to back up a bit, Suttree, at the end of this novel, the main character leaves Knoxville and goes west. This is published in 1979. In 1985, Blood Meridian's released. And Cormac McCarthy, as far as I'm aware, has made his home in the American West, in Arizona or New Mexico, somewhere like that, since that time. Still alive. Now, give me just a second. Now, the structure that this novel takes is, you could say it's a conventional Western in the broadest strokes. It has been referred to as an anti-Western because supposedly deconstructs and subverts typical conventions of the genre. So you might say that one of the themes in American Western film and fiction is cowboys versus Indians. And so there's the manifest destiny notion that the Americans just have to keep moving west until they hit the Pacific Ocean. They've got to conquer all the territory and all the peoples and all the resources along the way, and that this is necessary for American geopolitical interest, but it's also just the will of God. So you could say that that is the traditional recurring notion in the Western genre. Now, what Cormac McCarthy does in this book is he shows that it is not heroic. So this is where the liberal critique of the liberals would use this book to critique that notion of manifest destiny. They would say that because Cormac McCarthy shows this novel, shows through this novel that the way that this stuff took place was not actually heroism, but it was just despicable violence and greed and sin and evil, for lack of a better description, that he therefore doesn't believe in this notion of manifest destiny. That's completely wrong. That's completely and utterly wrong. They're unwilling to go down to the deepest level of what he says in this book, which is that, famously, one of the 3 main characters of this book says war is God. And this is the notion that Cormac McCarthy is putting forward in this book. He believes in race, he believes that it's a fundamental component, and he believes that war and violence are fundamental components of what it means to be human. And maybe we'll talk later on a little bit, if we have time, about the manga by Kentarou Miura, Berserk, because he makes similar claims and there's similar notions in there about the idea of evil. So if we have time, we'll get to that. Now, what we're going to do is we'll talk about the 3 main characters, and then we'll read some passages from here and try to build up this position I'm putting forward about race and violence, and about how they're totally essential and they can't be gotten rid of, can't be expunged, can't be removed from the world, and that's the message of the novel. So the first main character, the one that it starts with, is a 16-year-old boy. This is the first page of the novel. You can see the structure of it here. We have the chapter. We have this Hispano or Spanish literature tradition of putting the subheadings for events that occur within the chapter, and then you go into the book itself. So the main character of the book is an unnamed Tennessean who's born in 1933. The novel takes place for the most part in 48 and 49, and so for the most part the kid is 14, 15, 16 years old during the events. He's the main character, and he disappears in terms of the narrative for the middle part of the novel. He's there, but the novel doesn't talk about him specifically. He's a witness to the thing, and a participant, a witness and a participant to the things that are going on in the course of the novel. He's the main character. It begins and ends with him. The character who becomes the centerpiece of the novel in the middle part is a Texan scalp hunter named John Joel Glanton. And Glanton runs a gang of, mercenary, very eclectic band of mercenaries who kill, rape, and pillage their way from Texas to California through the course of the novel. Let's see if I can bring this back. Okay, yeah. So the inside cover of the book in some editions has got this map, and this is the territory that they go across in the course of the novel. And it's meticulously outlined during the body of the text itself, because that's the third thing that I forgot to mention. The novel is making the claim that geography, violence, and race are three things that cannot be expunged from the world. Okay, so those are the first two main characters. The third main character is a supernatural creature named Judge Holden. He's 7 feet tall. He is eggshell white. He is entirely hairless. He doesn't have a single hair of any kind on his entire body from head to toe. No body hair, no hair on his head, no hair in his nose, nothing. All right. He's 7 feet tall. He's incredibly strong. I think at one point in the novel, he's overhead pressing a very awkward object that weighs 300 pounds or something like that, and shot putting it like 20 feet. It's ridiculous. He is an extreme polymath and speaks multiple languages. So all of these characteristics are telling you that this guy is something more than human. And indeed, the things that he does and performs during the course of the novel are more than human. He shows up out of the blue in a supernatural way, and he doesn't age. It's pretty obvious. Now, but the first two main characters, the kid, which is what the 16, 15, 16-year-old guys referred to as the kid, and then Glanton, those guys are both human. The judge is not. And then there's a host of other characters. And it seems pretty clear that over the course of the novel that Judge Holden is sort of an avatar of war and violence. That's what he's doing in the novel. He's embodying those things as forces. It's speculated in some reviews and analysis of the book that he's a demon, and I think that's true. He's a demon. You could say that. So we'll talk about the race element here. One of the first incidents that happens in the course of the novel is that the kid is in Texas, and he falls in with a group of essentially irregular American army who are going back into Mexico after the Mexican-American War, and they're going to essentially start the war over again so that America can conquer Mexico in order to both have the territory and the resources, but then also to force the Europeans out, because as you know, there were plenty of there was European influence in Mexico, and certain American interests did not want this. So they're going to try to recruit the kid, and they succeed. But this is the captain of the army group that is going to essentially invade Mexico again after the ceasefire has already been declared. The captain leaned forward. We fought for it, lost friends and brothers down there. And then, by God, if we didn't give it back to a bunch of barbarians that even the most biased in their favor will admit have no least notion in God's earth of honor or justice or the meaning of republican government. A people so cowardly they've paid tribute 100 years to tribes of naked savages, given up their crops and livestock, mines shut down, whole villages abandoned, while a heathen horde rides over the land, looting and killing with total impunity. Not a hand raised against them. What kind of people are these? He's referring to Mexicans here. They kill them with rocks. The captain shook his head. He seemed to be made sad by what he had to tell. So, this is okay. Let me keep reading here on the next page. The captain leaned back and folded his arms. What we're dealing with, he said, is a race of degenerates, a mongrel race, little better than niggers, and maybe no better. There's no government in Mexico. Hell, there's no God in Mexico. Never will be. We're dealing with a people manifestly incapable of governing themselves. And you know what happens with people who cannot govern themselves? That's right. Others come in to govern for them. So this is that manifest destiny idea and the racial doctrine. Of course, what happens, I'll go ahead and ruin it for you, is that the filibusters, the American Army group, gets into Mexico, and they are attacked by a band of Apaches that they were not expecting, and almost all of them are killed. And so to give you an idea of the kind of violence and the way that Cormac McCarthy builds this story, I'm going to read to you one of the more famous scenes from the novel. So this is the Americans. I don't know how many hundred of them there are, maybe 100 or 200. Let's see here. They see some dust in the distance. They're not really sure what it is. Then they notice that it's it's a herd of cattle and mules and horses. The first of the herd began to swing past them in a pall of yellow dust, rangy, slat-ribbed cattle with horns that grew agoggle and no two alike, and small, thin mules, coal-black, that shouldered one another and reared their mallet-shaped heads above the backs of the others, and then more cattle, and finally the first of the herders, riding up the outer side and keeping the stock between themselves and the mounted company. Behind them came a herd of several hundred ponies. The sergeant looked for Candelario, which was their Mexican scout. He kept backing along the ranks, but he could not find him. He nudged his horse through the columns and moved up to the far side. The lattermost of the drovers were now coming through the dust, and the captain was gesturing and shouting. The ponies had begun to veer off from the herd, and the drovers were beating their way toward this armed company, met with on the plain. Already you could see the dust on the ponies' hides. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides the painted chevrons, and the hands, and rising suns, and birds and fish of every device like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now, too, you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones, and some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the offside of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers bearing shields, bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpierced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, the coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings, and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber, done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings, like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue, and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke, like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip, jerks, and drools. "Oh my God," said the sergeant. A rattling of arrows passed through the company, and men tottered and dropped from their mounts. Horses were rearing and plunging, and the Mongol horde swung up along their flanks and turned and rode full upon them with their lances. The company was now come to a halt, and the first shots were fired, and the gray rifle smoke rolled through the dust as the lancers breached their ranks. The kid's horse sank beneath him with a long pneumatic sigh. He had already fired his rifle, and now he sat on the ground and fumbled with his shot pouch. A man near him sat with an arrow hanging out of his neck. He was bent slightly as if in prayer. We'll skip down a little bit more here. Now driving in a wild freeze of headlong horses with eyes walled and teeth cropped, and naked riders with clusters of arrows clenched in their jaws and their shields, winking in the dust, and up the far side of the ruined ranks, and a piping of bone flutes, and dropping down off the sides of their mounts with one heel hung in the wither strap, and their short bows flexing beneath the outstretched necks of the ponies until they'd circled the company and cut their ranks in two, and then rising up again like funhouse figures, some with nightmare faces painted on their breasts, riding down the unhorsed Saxons and spearing and clubbing them, and leaping from their mounts with knives, and running about on the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot, like creatures driven to alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead, and seizing them up by their hair, and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike, and snatching aloft the bloody wigs, and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals, some of the savages so slathered up with gore they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some who fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. And it just goes on and on like that. And so this company from America, these American guys who are setting out to restart this Mexican-American war, get obliterated along the way by a third party, something they did not even think about or intend to deal with. And this is sort of the course of the novel, is that these forces of the Mexicans, the Apaches, and the American group are all constantly bumping into each other and murdering each other. Civilians, soldiers, American Indian warriors, it just keeps going back and forth like that. But already, it's this conflict of these racial groups, and it's not an explicitly political doctrine in that. The republicanism that the captain referred to, like these people don't know what a republic is or they're not fit for it. This is just a stand-in for these great historical forces that are moving along. Now, one of the more interesting things about the group of American Glanton's gang, the Glanton gang, is that it is multiracial. It is a multicultural gang. It is mostly whites, mostly Anglo-Irish, Anglo-British, the founding American stock of the American Republic. It's those kind of people, but then there are a group of northeastern woodland Indians, the Lenape or Delaware tribe. There's an unknown number of Delaware Indians in the tribe, like 6 or 8 of them. Or in the gang, rather, not the tribe. There's 6 or 8 of these guys in the gang, and then there's also a black guy and one Mexican. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you what the novel has to say about what the author has to say about these Indians, because of course most of the people that they're killing, I think the majority of the people that the Glanton gang kills in the novel are indigenous Americans, but they're from, they're Apaches, they're Western, and these northeastern woodland Indians don't have any trouble killing. No common racial identity there. So one of the Delaware Indians is killed, and then in response we're going to get a little bit of insight into what's going on with them. They did not speak. They were men of another time, for all that they bore Christian names, and they had lived all their lives in a wilderness, as had their fathers before them. They learnt war by warring, the generations driven from the eastern shore across the continent, from the ashes at Gnadenhutten onto the prairies, and across the outlet to the bloodlands of the west. If much in the world were mystery, the limits of that world were not, for it was without measure or bound, and there were contained within it creatures more horrible yet, and men of other colors, and beings which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien none of it, more than were their own hearts, alien in them, whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. So, you'll have to read that slowly on your own if you want to try to really understand what he's saying. I'm not sure that I completely do, but I know that these Delawares, these Lenape Indians, they are now subscribed to the religion of war as a result of being cast out of their homelands, and they're on a fatal trajectory to the west where they will all die. And we're going to read something later and talk a little bit about nihilism and Stavrogin from Dostoevsky's The Possessed, but they don't. Let's just read this real quickly again. And for it was without measure or bound, and there were contained within it creatures more horrible yet, and men of other colors, and beings which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien none of it, more than were their own hearts alien in them, whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. Okay, I'm adding this section in because I forgot it when I originally recorded the video, but one of the features of the Glanton Gang is its multiracial or multicultural dimension, in which it's composed mostly of whites or Northern European Americans, but there's also one Mexican and one black. There is a conflict in the gang between two men named Jackson, White Jackson and Black Jackson. And White Jackson is constantly shadowing Black Jackson and provoking him. And so this is the end of their relationship. They camped that night on the foreplain at the foot of a talus slope, and the murder that had been reckoned upon took place. And so constantly in this novel, people are making expectations and prophecies and wagers about murder and violence because, again, you can't get rid of it. It's just a matter of when. Death is not a matter of if, but a matter of when and how. The white man Jackson had been drunk in Llanos, and he had ridden red-eyed and sullen for 2 days through the mountains. He now sat disheveled by the fire, with his boots off, drinking aguardiente from a flask, circumscribed about by his companions and by the cries of wolves and providence of night. He was sitting so when the black approached the fire and threw down his apishamore and sat upon it and fell to stoking his pipe. There were 2 fires in this camp, and no real rules are tacit as to who should use them. But when the white man looked to the other fire, and he saw that the Delawares and John McGill is how the Americans pronounce Juan Miguel, okay? So the Delawares and John McGill and the new men in the company, who were white, had taken their supper there, and with a gesture and a slurred oath, he warned the black away. So I've made the argument at some point in this video towards the end that within war, within this brotherhood of blood and this unity through violence and through this engagement in eternal war, these guys surpass their racial differences and they become a band of brothers, for lack of a better word. However, White Jackson is saying that we've got a clear hierarchy here between these 2 campfires. You have the non-whites and the new guys at one fire, and who's at the other fire? It's the white men and the veterans. Here, beyond men's judgments, all covenants were brittle. The black looked up from his pipe bowl. About that fire were men whose eyes gave back the light like coals socketed hot in their skulls, and men whose eyes did not. But the black man's eyes stood as corridors for the ferrying through of naked and unrectified night, from what of it lay behind to what was yet to come. Any man in this company can sit where it suits him, he said. The white man swung his head, one eye half closed, his lip loose. His gun belt lay coiled on the ground. He reached and drew the revolver and cocked it. 4 men rose and moved away. "You aim to shoot me?" said the black. "You don't get your black ass away from this fire, I'll kill you graveyard dead." He looked to where Glanton sat. Glanton watched him. He put the pipe in his mouth and rose and took up the episcomore and folded it over his arm. "Is that your final say?" "Final as the judgment of God." The black looked once more across the flames at Glanton, and then he moved away in the dark. Just one second. The white man uncocked the revolver and placed it on the ground before him. 2 of the others came back to the fire and stood uneasily. Notice 4 got up, only 2 came back to the fire. Jackson sat, his legs crossed. One hand lay in his lap, and the other was outstretched on his knee, holding a slender black cigarillo. The nearest man to him was Tobin, and when the black stepped out of the darkness, bearing the bowie knife in both hands, like some instrument of ceremony, Tobin started to rise. The white man looked up drunkenly, and the black stepped forward and with a single stroke swapped off his head. 2 thick ropes of dark blood and too slender rose like snakes from the stump of his neck and arched hissing into the fire. The head rolled to the left and came to rest at the ex-priest's feet, where it lay with eyes aghast. Tobin jerked his foot away and rose and stepped back. The fire steamed and blackened, and a gray cloud of smoke rose, and the columnar arches of blood slowly subsided until just the neck bubbled gently like a stew, and then that too was stilled. He was sat as before, save headless, drenched in blood, the cigarillo still between his fingers, leaning toward the dark and smoking grotto in the flames where his life had gone. Glanton rose. The men moved away. No one spoke. When they set out in the dawn, the headless man was sitting like a murdered anchorite, discalced in ashes and sark. Someone had taken his gun, but the boots stood where he'd put them. The company rode on. They had not gone forth 1 hour upon that plain before they were ridden upon by the Apaches. So what is there to learn from this section? In this brotherhood of blood, in this brotherhood of war, race still exists, and if there's 2 campfires, these people are naturally going to split up into different groups of a higher and lower hierarchy of which race plays a role. But trying to enforce that hierarchy beyond how these people naturally want to gravitate into it is unnatural, and that's why within the context of the gang, Glanton was totally willing to let these guys settle it amongst themselves as it was settled. Now, another thing that we haven't talked about and they're not going to talk about is the mirror form of this novel. The entire thing is mirrored, and directly in the middle of the novel there is a small paragraph that describes how this occurs. But this is just one more element that we don't have time to get into, and these kind of things are why I think this is the greatest American novel of the 20th century and in the list of greatest novels of all time, and why it's literature, not fiction. But there's a similar occurrence later on in the other half of the novel that's very similar to this, not quite identical, but it's the case in which the black kills another white man due to this kind of issue about race. And it's a complicated thing, and you could easily read it as anti-racism if you wanted to, and you don't go down to the bottom level of this book and work yourself back up from the essentialism. But the idea is simply that this stuff exists, you can't get rid of it, but within the brotherhood of the gang, you have transcended these racial barriers to the extent that they would exist in normal society, because these guys are beyond morals, they're beyond civilization, they're beyond the judgment of others. They're operating in that Nietzschean sense of beyond good and evil, and that's why these things are why it's possible for them to have these kind of arrangements which would never exist in any civilized capacity. Let's talk a bit more about the kid. He runs away from home at 14 years old. His mother is dead. His father is a drunk schoolmaster who did not even teach his son how to read and write. And it says here that due to his father's alcoholism and complete inability to raise his child, he watches, pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. All history present in that visage, the child, the father of the man. And this is the repeated theme in Cormac McCarthy's work, the relationship between the absent father, the dead father, or the father that can't fulfill his duties. This goes all the way back to Outer Dark and Satri. And this is the beginning of the novel. This is where the novel comes in. At 14, he runs away. He'll never see his father, his sister, or his home again. He goes from wherever he is in Tennessee to St. Louis, Missouri, and then they take a paddle boat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. It says here they break up the float and sell the lumber, and he walks in the streets, this is in New Orleans, and hears tongues he's not heard before. He lives in a room above a courtyard behind a tavern, and he comes down at night like some fairy book beast to fight with the sailors. So this means at the age of 14, 15, 16, he's working in a bouncer. He's working as a bouncer in a bar or a tavern in New Orleans. He is not big, but he has big wrists, big hands. His shoulders are set close. The child's face is curiously untouched behind the scars, the eyes oddly innocent. They fight with fists, with feet, with bottles or knives. All races, all breeds. Men whose speech sounds like the grunting of apes. Men from lands so far and queer that standing over them where they lie bleeding in the mud, he feels mankind itself vindicated. This is some pretty heavy stuff for the second page of a novel, wouldn't you say? This teenager with a taste for mindless violence is white, no less. This young white man with a taste for mindless violence is beating and conquering these sailors from all races and all breeds, and standing over them. They are from lands so far away and so strange, so queer, that standing over them where they lie bleeding in the mud, he feels mankind itself vindicated. On a certain night, a Maltese boatswain shoots him in the back with a small pistol. Swinging to deal with the man, he's shot again just below the heart. This man flees, and he leans against the bar with the blood running out of his shirt. The others look away. After a while, he sits in the floor. And so, from this, that like Holden and like Glanton, there's something special about this kid because he seems to conquer everybody he comes across. He's operating on a different level and a higher level, and he's shot twice at 16, and he ends up being nursed back to health. And after that, he leaves New Orleans, crosses over into Texas, goes through Nacogdoches, and there he encounters Judge Holden. And so something that happens to every character in this novel, every member of the Glanton gang, is that before they join the gang, they encounter the judge somewhere else. And so this is that brotherhood of war and violence. It's almost like The judge is a sink or a gravity well sitting at the bottom of somewhere, and all these different guys are spinning around, being slowly drawn towards the judge. And once they hook up with him, they are inevitably on a path to their own death. But they're going to kill a lot of other people along the way. Now, I read that to you, and then of course, I don't know if I've mentioned yet in the video, I will mention it at some point, but the structure of this novel is mirrored. The first half of the novel and the second half of the novel are mirror images of each other, but everything is different. But the events, you can find a correspondence in the first and second half for almost every event in the novel, and this is one of the reasons why I'm saying this is one of the greatest novels of 20th century literature and American literature for sure, is because he's able to work in these themes of essentialism, prior essence, along with great writing skill, and then this technical construction and the religious and spiritual components. Let me pause this and find the other thing I'm looking for. Okay, so this occurs towards the end of the novel. This is after he's already left the Glanton gang. Let's see here. And now he's traveling. This is, he's probably 20 years old by this point. He saw men killed with guns and with knives and ropes. And he saw women fought over to the death, whose value they themselves set at $2. So let me ask you a quick question there. Immanuel Kant and all these other people, the liberals of the world, the original liberals, they said that if we simply get enough consumer goods and enough trade, we can get rid of war and violence forever, because people only want to fight over resources. So if we just create enough resources, then there won't be any fighting anymore. And this is what Kant called the perpetual peace, or the liberal peace. Now, Cormac McCarthy says that he saw women whose value they themselves set at $2, fought over to the death. Okay? These men who were fighting over these women had $2 each. They could have each had this whore. They could have paid for her services. But that's not what life's about. And these people who think that everything is about resources and materialism and consumer goods, they're on one side of the equation, and we are on the other. He saw ships from the land of China chained in the small harbors, and bales of tea and silks and spices broken open with swords by small yellow men with speech like cats. So this is the parallel in the novel to his stay in New Orleans, in which he's encountering all these strange nationalities, races, and breeds of men from all over planet Earth. When he gets to, where are we, Los Angeles? He saw ships from the land of China chained in the small harbors, and bales of tea and silks and spices broken open with swords by small yellow men with speech like cats. So take that for what you will. I think we'll leave that there, but from the perspective of this main character, the kid, he can't even read or write, and yet he is experiencing the fullness and the plenitude of what exists. And his taste for mindless violence, as I think I've already said somewhere in here, does not extend toward torturing innocents or attacking people who haven't done anything to him, but he is always ready to attack someone and triumph over them and leave them lying in their own blood if they attack him, or if they simply just challenge his authority. There's one scene in the novel where he is sitting in jail, I think in Chihuahua City, and him and several other Americans are sitting in this mud prison, and there are a little group of Mexican boys walking up on the mud parapet. They're in like a courtyard, and then there's a mud wall going around the top of it, and there are little Mexican boys up there who are pissing on the American prisoners and throwing rocks at them. And so the kid picks up a rock and throws it and knocks one of these Mexican boys in the head, and he falls off that mud wall and lands on the ground with an audible thump. So the point is that the kid would never have attacked one of these Mexican children had they not attacked first, but since they've done so, he feels absolutely no compunction and no regret, no remorse, no inhibition about attacking them. This is what would separate him from Glanton and the judge, is that they, on the other hand, and also the kid and Toadvine are the same way, they share that, and Tobin, the ex-priest, they share that. But then on the other side, you have the people who are completely under the spell of nihilism and evil, essentially, and they would attack and kill children, old women, just civilians who haven't done anything to anybody. So that's sort of the difference between the two moralities that are at play in the novel. And I'm not sure if Cormac McCarthy is making a value judgment here about one over the other, but he's definitely saying that these are two of the ways that you can interact with the world and at least be honest, without being draped in these false notions of overly civilized behavior that no one really believes in anyway, and it's just virtue signaling. Okay, let's move on. So after the American filibustering gang is wiped out, the kid then falls in with the Glanton gang. And the next thing that happens is that the gang has to be outfitted with 2 pistols for each horseman. And so that's what makes them dragoons, I think, is that they have a rifle and 2 pistols. And then they also have like a large Bowie knife or something like that. So that's how each man in the company is equipped. And this is a very versatile kit of gear that they would have. And so after they get outfitted with their new pistols, these Whitneyville Colt revolvers, which are just like state-of-the-art weapons for that time. They're some of the most well-armed people in that part of the world, basically. And it is no accident that, let me read this to you. Earlier that morning, the company had met in a courtyard behind a house on the outskirts of the city. 2 men carried from a wagon a stenciled ordnance box from the Baton Rouge arsenal. That's the capital of Louisiana. And a Prussian Jew named Spire pried open the box with a pritchel and a shoeing hammer and handed up a flat package in brown butcher paper, translucent with grease like a paper of bakery goods. So the means by which the Glanton gang acquires some of the deadliest technology of the era to go on the scalp hunting mission, and then by which they kill not only many Apaches and Comanches, but also just mestizos and peons, just regular Mexicans. It's all accomplished with the help of a Prussian Jew named Spire, who is selling weapons from the Baton Rouge arsenal in Louisiana. So, kind of interesting, Cormac McCarthy. What are you trying to say? Are you trying to say something about Judaism and arms dealing? Because we've never known that to be the case. So then what happens is that John Joel Glanton, the leader of his gang, just starts firing the pistol. He loads the pistol and starts shooting everything around him. He kills 2 birds, a goat, a cat, and rings the bell in the town square. We'll talk about Glanton later, but he doesn't give a damn. And so then the demon, Judge Holden, has to negotiate with the police to get the gang out of the town. And this involves these pleasantries by which the police who come to investigate have to be introduced to each member of the gang, shake hands, and exchange these pleasantries. Now, one of the members of the gang is Black. Black Jackson is his name. And the sergeant has never seen, this Mexican police sergeant's never seen a black person before. And so Judge Holden, the polymath, the demon, is going to then explain to the sergeant, because the demon constantly talks and lectures to everybody around him all the time. So he's got to do this about the nature of the Africans. So what we're going to do is we're going to read this little section here. The judge escorted him from one to the next of the company, the sergeant formal, and the Americans muttering obscenities or shaking their heads silently. The soldiers squatted on their heels and watched each movement in this charade with the same dull interest, and at length the judge hove up before the black. That dark, vexed face. He studied it, and he drew the sergeant forward the better for him to observe, and then he began a laborious introduction in Spanish. He sketched for the sergeant a problematic career of the man before him, his hands drafting with a marvelous dexterity the shapes of what varied paths conspired here in the ultimate authority of the extant, as he told them, like strings drawn together through the eye of a ring. He adduced for their consideration references to the children of Ham, the lost tribes of Israelites, certain passages from the Greek poets, anthropological speculations as to the propagation of the races in their dispersion and isolation through the agency of geological cataclysm, and an assortment of racial traits with respect to the climatic and geographical influences. Let's follow that again. What Cormac McCarthy is doing is very interesting here through Holden. He's building up this evolution of human racial knowledge and the discourse surrounding it. So he adduced for their consideration references to the children of Ham. Okay, so this is the biblical passage from Noah about Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the propagation of world population through those people. And then the lost tribes of Israelites, and that's from the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity and the dispersion there, and those people creating different groups. Certain passages from the Greek poets. So you have the Hebrew tradition, and then you have the Greek classical tradition, which comes after that, so partially. Anthropological speculations as to the propagation of the races in their dispersion and isolation through the agency of geological cataclysm. So now we've taken the story of Noah and reduced it to geological cataclysm, dispersion, and isolation, but it's been stripped of its particular context and made more general. And an assessment of racial traits with respect to climatic and geographical influences. And so that's the 19th century tradition of trying to figure out what's going on with race. It's a result of these environmental pressures, which we're still in this mode today in the thinking. The sergeant listened to this and more with great attention, and when the judge was done, he stepped forward and held out his hand. So this ignorant Mexican police sergeant listens to this great discourse on the race and origins of this African that's standing before him and reaches out his hand to him. Jackson ignored him. He looked at the judge. "What'd you tell him, Holden?" "Don't insult him, man." "What'd you tell him?" The sergeant's face had clouded. The judge took him about the shoulders and leaned and spoke into his ear, and the sergeant nodded and stepped back and saluted the black. "What did you tell him, Holden?" "That shaking hands was not the custom in your land." "Before that?" "What'd you say to him before that?" The judge smiled. "It is not necessary," he said, "that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history with or without their understanding. But it is consistent with notions of right principle that these facts, to the extent that they can be readily made to do so, should find a repository in the witness of some third party. Sergeant Aguilar is just such a party, and any slight to his office is but a secondary consideration when compared to divergences in that larger protocol exacted by the formal agenda of an absolute destiny. Words are things. The words he is in possession of, he cannot be deprived of. Their authority transcends his ignorance of their meaning." The black was sweating. A dark vein in his temple pulsed like a fuse. And then they leave town with their guns. Let me pause this and we'll move on. Just moving along to another couple other occurrences of this race stuff that occur back to back. The gang comes along. A couple of Germans who were shipwrecked in Mexico, and they're living out in the middle of nowhere, and they're essentially crazy. And the gang shoots one of them, kills him, and the other guys, they're riding away. Glanton says to the judge, should have shot the other one too. I don't like to see white men that way, Glanton said. Dutch, by which he means German. Dutch or whatever. I don't like it. And so there's the notion that within the mind of the individual, you see someone who looks like you see something that's happened to them, and then you see that it's a possibility that it could happen to you too. Whereas if it's an alien face, if you're Glanton and you're seeing something happen to a Mexican or one of the Indians, it doesn't feel the same. And then the gang finds 4 of their own members who were scouts who've been killed. They come across 4 members of their own party that were separated from them, and they've been caught and killed. So I'll read that to you. They found the lost scouts hanging head downward from the limbs of a fire-blacked Palo Verde tree. They were skewered through the cords of their heels with sharpened shuttles of green wood, and they hung gray and naked above the dead ashes of the coals where they'd been roasted until their heads had charred and the brains bubbled in the skulls and steam sang from their nose holes. Their tongues were drawn out and held with sharpened sticks thrust through them, and they had been docked of their ears. Their torsos were sliced open with flints until the entrails hung down on their chests. Some of the men pushed forward with their knives and cut the bodies down, and they left them there in the ashes. 2 of the darker forms were the last of the Delawares, and then the other 2 were white, European. Among their barbarous hosts, they had met with neither favor nor discrimination, but had suffered and died impartially. So what we seem to encounter here in the novel repeatedly is that there's sort of a brotherhood of blood in which, within the context of war and eternal war and violence, which is what's represented by Holden and his philosophy, within that context, your differences, your racial differences, which are essential and impossible to get rid of, and your geographical differences, essential, impossible to get rid of, they're all made equal within that context of war and eternal bloodshed. And now let's read just a little bit about Glanton towards the end of the novel, thinking about what's happened. That night, Glanton stared long into the embers of the fire. All about him, his men were sleeping, but much was changed. So many gone, defected or dead. The Delawares all slain. He watched the fire, and if he saw portents there, it was much the same to him. He would live to look upon the western sea, and he was equal to whatever might follow, for he was complete at every hour. Whether his history should run concomitant with men and nations, or whether it should cease. He had long forsworn all weighing of consequence, and allowing as he did that men's destinies are given. Yet he usurped to contain within him all that he would ever be in the world, and all the world would ever be to him. And, be his charter written in the Urstone itself, he claimed agency, and said so, and he'd drive the remorseless sun on to its final endarkenment, as if he'd ordered it all ages since, before there were paths anywhere, before there were men or suns to go upon them. Cormac McCarthy has written John Joel Glanton as sort of like Nietzsche's ideal of the higher human being. He's beyond morality. He's beyond good and evil. And he believes that all men's destinies are given. So he believes in determinism. And yet, he claimed agency and said so. So this is the idea that within determinism, you can still have agency and free will if your morality transcends what is given. So this character, this leader of this gang of murderers, evil murderers, evil murdering scoundrels, he is trying to transcend the constraints of the world through never regretting anything, not fearing his own death, and being comfortable in himself at all times. Never weighs consequences. This is very similar to the character of Nikolai Vsevolotovich Stavrogin from Demons, the Possessed. This is the higher form of nihilism. The lower form of nihilism is the notion that nothing matters, so just do what you want. That's the lowest form. One form above that is materialism. So you have like these, democratic socialists or whatever who just want everybody to have the, same consumer goods, and they call themselves nihilists too. The higher form, which is, I think, shown by Glanton and Stavrogin, is that the only thing that you have to work with is your own will. And to the extent that you can fully embody the capabilities of your will, you're achieving the most that you can. Give me just a second. Sorry, I've got horrible allergies. So I don't know if we can say any more about that, but it's just the idea that the kid, on the other hand, the other main character, he does not take this approach. So Cormac McCarthy is putting these two different ideas against each other. Glanton kills people in this novel who have done absolutely nothing to him. He would essentially kill someone just as soon as look at them, because this is the way that he can show that he is totally uninhibited and unbound by any other force or opinion or impulse or threat. If you threatened him, he would probably have to kill you just to show that you weren't capable of exerting an influence on him. These are very similar ideas to what Dostoevsky deals with, both with Kirillov, Shatov, and Stavrogin, all three of them. Now, the kid, the main character of the novel, on the other hand, he has, I would say, more of a traditional pagan-style morality, in which if you confront him, he will attack you, but he will not attack any other passive third party. And both he and his friend Toadvine in the novel are similar in that regard. They don't want to attack innocents. They don't want to attack weaklings. They will do it, but that's not something that they seek out to do. They want to battle and fight and show strength and develop themselves and see things and do things, but they don't have this higher order nihilism that Glanton is experiencing. Let's see, I've got one more thing I'd like to read from here. So now the judge, toward the very end of the novel, the kid is being operated on for an arrow wound or a bullet wound or something, and he essentially goes into a fever, and he has a fever dream where the judge visits him. And I've had fever dreams when I've been sick, and it's a very interesting and profound experience, and I can even remember those dreams very clearly. So that's what we're writing about here. In that sleep, and in sleeps to follow, the judge did visit. Who would come other? A great shambling mutant, silent and serene. Whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other than their sum, nor was their system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go. Who would seek out his history? Now, this is key for our understanding of the approach of this author and the ideas he's dealing with. Whoever would seek out his history, through what unraveling of loins and ledger books? That's what history is. It's loins and ledger books. It's blood and records. must stand at last, darkened and dumb. Okay, so you're trying to figure out the origin of this otherworldly supernatural demon. You're going through loins and ledger books, but this person must at last stand darkened and dumb at the shore of a void without terminus or origin, and whatever science he might bring to bear upon the dusty primal matter blowing down out of the millennia will discover no trace of any ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon his commencing. So what does that sound like to you guys? Does that sound like essentialism? Does that sound like this demon of violence and war can be eliminated with a world federation for pacifism and for the spread of neoliberalism and trade and democracy? Does that sound like that's what this author's saying? Would stand darkened and dumb at the shore of a void. In the white and empty room, he stood in his bespoken suit with his hat in his hand, and he peered down with his small and lashless pig's eyes, wherein this child, just 16 years on earth, could read whole bodies of decisions, not accountable to the courts of men. And he saw his own name, which nowhere else he could have ciphered out at all, logged into the records as a thing already accomplished, a traveler known in jurisdictions, existing only in the claims of certain pensioners or on old dated maps. So in this world, in this fever dream, your name is in the book of nature, and there are these forces that come from antecedents that we're not aware of and that are indestructible. Let's say, whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other than their sum, nor was there system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go. So whatever this guy is, you're not going to be able to get rid of him. Let's see if I can find one more thing I wanted to talk about in this section. There's a passage here that relates to the Gnostic stuff that I said we wouldn't get into, but next to the judge, there's a cold forger working with hammer and die. That's probably the Demiurgos from the Gnostic stuff. Let me pause this. I'm trying to find one more thing. I can't find what I was looking for, but repeatedly throughout the novel, you can find these notions that Judge Holden is something that humans are not going to be able to get away from, and he's ever present. He might be more prominent in some circumstances than others, but he is an indissoluble element of human life. And if he's violence and war, then that's a fact. That's just what it's like. And like any other sin and any other force of evil in the world, Holden could be more prominent in sometimes places than others. Now, to me, one of my friends is very much into Joseph de Maistre, and he was this guy who lived, a nobleman who lived through the French Revolution, and so he saw what the Ancien regime was like, he saw what life was like after that, and during the revolution itself, and he is extremely pessimistic about human nature, and about violence in the world. And for him, it's indissoluble. And I think it would perhaps be fruitful, and maybe we can try to do this in the future, I'm not sure, is to put these notions that Cormac McCarthy is bringing us here together with Joseph de Maistre, who's a first-rate political philosopher, even though I don't think his works are very huge. There's not a huge quantity of his works, but they're very influential. And I was listening to George Sorel, or reading George Sorel just a couple of days ago when he was talking about de Maistre, and they couldn't be more different in terms of their political outlook, but they're both interested in violence, and that's where they connect. The other thing I said I wanted to bring in was Kentarou Miura and his manga Berserk. In that, it's a story about humans unlocking this perennial force of evil. Again, it's demons, this perennial force of evil in the world through sin. And then they make everything even worse. So one sin leads to a greater sin, and then even more, and lots of death, destruction, suffering, and evil more generally. In one chapter of that manga, during, I think, the middle of its run, the author revealed that the 5 evil gods who are lurking behind most of the action in the manga itself, that their other dimensional, otherworldly temple, where their wellspring of power resides, is actually shaped like a double helix. It looks like human DNA, and this is the like the ultimate reality of evil. So this is what he's saying is that these gods, which look like they're actually torturing humans and inflicting suffering and evil on them, are actually just part of humanity, and that the soul of humanity, wherever it resides out there, is the source of these evil gods. And I thought that was quite profound, and I've never seen anyone else talk about it or write about it. But certainly in trying to deal with the problem of evil, it's an interesting take on it. And if, coming from a perspective like that from Miura, it's permanent. It's not going away. It's just part of what humans are. And that's, it seems to me, that's what Cormac McCarthy's saying. Seems to me that's what Joseph de Maistre's saying. De Maistre's solution was to have a very powerful authoritarian monarch to try to push all this evil down and restrain it. Maybe that's the best that we can possibly do. Okay, the reason that we talked about Cormac McCarthy at such great length and read so much from his works is because he is totally opposed in every possible way to liberalism, to republicanism, and to democracy, and all of these other false notions of modernity. You have to dig down to the bottom level of his books and the philosophy behind them to see what's actually there, and it's a philosophy of, essentialism, and of which race is a prominent component. Geography, race, and these permanent world forces that are exerting such great influences on human life, history, and culture. Okay? Thank you for your time.